Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Making money is one of the most important aspects in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 and 2, as without money you cannot afford anything, and that's kind of detrimental in a video game all about building stuff. The thing is though, it's really quite easy to run out of money and get stuck not being able to expand your park. That is why in this video I will teach you the most effective ways to make money and make sure you don't go broke in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 and RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic. And even though some exact numbers may differ a little bit, this advice will also work in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. Before we start though, I want to let you know that if you want to see me apply all this knowledge in reality while playing the game, you can catch me live on Twitch. I stream twice a week, usually on Sunday and Wednesday at 7 PM Central European Time. I will see you there. Alright, there are two types of parks, ones where you charge for the rides and ones where you charge for the park entry. Making money in these two different kinds of parks works quite differently, and we'll start with discussing parks where you charge for the rides. The obvious and most important thing here is to make the rides as expensive as possible. After all, the more guests pay for them, the more money you make. In theory, this could have been a complicated balancing act, where at a certain price some guests will still want to pay but others won't. But that's not the case. Every ride has a certain price point below which everyone will go on it and pay for it, and above which no one will. Usually you can charge a lot more than the default price that the game sets, especially on roller coasters and thrill rides. For example, the default price on a looping coaster is €2, but that's laughably little. In Diamond Heights, the developers already put the price at $5 for the two big coasters instead of 2, which is significantly more, but that's still not the maximum that guests are willing to pay for these. No, you can charge up to €8.40 on agoraphobia and even €9 on claustrophobia. And that is with them being 3 years old. If they were brand new, you could charge more than €12. How this is calculated is a bit complicated, and you can watch my video about the ride ticket prices if you want to know the exact formulas, but luckily there is a handy calculator made by Shotty Steve that you can use. Simply put in the ride type, the excitement intensity and nausea ratings, and whether you have multiple of that ride type in your park, and it will now show you how much you can charge depending on the age of the ride, as the maximum ticket price goes down as the ride gets older. For new rides there can be a bit of a difference between OpenRCT2 and the vanilla games, but unless you're charging the absolute maximum, this difference is usually small enough that you won't notice it. There's also a button in this calculator that asks whether you're charging for the park entry. That's because in all the scenarios in the base game and first expansion of RollerCoaster Tycoon 1, you can choose which to charge for and even do both. RCT2 and Classic don't have that option, but OpenRCT2 brought it back. If you charge anything for the park entry in these parks, then you can only charge a quarter of the usual maximum price for rides. This maximum is a hard line. If you charge more than the maximum ticket price, then no guest will ever ride it. And if you charge below that threshold, everyone will ride it. Or well, the stats still have to fall within their preferences, but you know what I mean. There is no difference between the guest's willingness to ride a free ride and to ride one that has the highest ticket price they'll pay. It's all the same. However, it may not be entirely feasible to charge the maximum for every ride, as that means that every time a ride decreases in value, you also have to lower the price. This is doable in a very small park, but it quickly becomes way too much to keep up with. To make it easier on yourself, you could just charge the third price down from the start, which is good until the ride turns 40 months, which is 5 years, old. A decent rule of thumb is to charge the same as the excitement rating, which will usually guarantee that it will be fine for 5 years. Quick note, all the different currencies in the game are actually all the same. If something costs €12, then it will also cost $12 or £12. Some currencies, such as the yen, do have a conversion factor, but it's always a factor of 10, 100 or 1000, so it's really easy to do. The only thing that changes is the symbol and where the decimal point is. There is a solution to this aging problem, and that is to renew your rides. In the vanilla game you do this by literally deleting and replacing it with a new one, but OpenRCT2 has added a refurbish button to make this easier. It still costs the same, 30% of the original cost, but it's quicker and it allows you to renew underground rides as well. You can't build a saved ride design partly underground, so renewing this mine train coaster is not a fun job. But with that refurbish button, it's just as easy as any other ride. Renewing a ride not only allows you to charge the original maximum price again, but it also makes it 100% reliable once more, reducing the chance for breakdowns and crashes. If you do want to channel your inner Scrooge McDuck and always squeeze the most money out of your guests as possible and don't mind cheating a little bit, then you can use the Price Manager plugin created by Sadrat. It automatically updates every single ride price to the maximum that guests will want to pay for it, and you can even put limitations on it if you want to punish yourself for being a lazy little bitch and using this instead of doing it manually. Another factor is the throughput of your rides. You may be able to charge 18 euros for a very big roller coaster, but if guests are also still willing to pay 9 euros for a ride that is 3 times as short, then that ride will make more money. Therefore, it's generally a good idea to build more smaller rides instead of a few big ones, as the small ones usually have a higher ticket price relative to the ride duration and construction cost. This advice only goes for if you need to make the most money possible. With just normal rides and cash machines, you can already easily make more money than you ever need to build a really nice and beautiful park. Rides are not the only way to make money. You can also sell food, drinks, souvenirs and on-ride photos. For example, in this Forest Frontiers park, the profit from shops and stalls is on average about 10% of my total income. I do charge a fair bit more than the default for my ride, but I'm also still quite a bit under the maximum possible. Shop and stall profit will rarely be the majority of your income, but if you do charge very little for your rides, they can be a significant factor. This too is a thing that you can optimize, and the default prices that the game sets for items are quite a bit lower than the maximum that guests are willing to pay. The maximum depends on the item and the temperature, and here is a table listing the maximum price for every item in every temperature range. That's not where it ends though, as the happier the guests are, the more likely they are willing to pay even more than this. So if your guests are generally quite happy, you can get away with charging maybe even a full euro more than the maximum listed here. For all the tiny details, you should watch my video about stall prices, which, just like all the other videos I mentioned, is linked in the description. Spending a lot of time on maximizing the stall prices is probably not worth it, although to be fair, it doesn't really take much time to increase the price on a few stall types and hit that same price across park button. I personally rarely do it. I usually just put the umbrella price at the maximum of 20 bucks and leave everything else standard. Oh yeah, that's right, I haven't told you about the umbrella trick yet. 20 bucks is far above the maximum that guests are willing to pay for umbrellas, so no one will buy them. However, they make an exception when it's raining, and then they will spend anything to stop the process of them getting wet. So when you do this and it starts to rain, then suddenly every guest can buy a super expensive umbrella since no one has one yet, which makes you a ton of money. All these money making tricks that we've discussed, charging for the rides, increasing stall prices and the umbrella trick, are great, but there's a good chance that they are also entirely useless. It all depends on whether you have access to the cash machine. If you do not have it, and it doesn't exist yet in RCT1, so there no scenario has it, then guests will never spend more than what they spawn with, no matter how expensive your rides and stalls are. You can still make your rides super expensive and it will make you money slightly faster initially, but in the long run it makes no difference and the guests spend the same amount, just faster. In fact, doing this can even prevent you from completing the goal. I once tried to prove to my brother that I could get to the goal of Crazy Castle in under a year. It started off great, I made tons of money, built tons of rides and got a lot of guests very quickly. But just before I hit the goal of 1500 guests, the count stopped increasing. Why? Because all my guests were going broke quicker than I could get 1500 guests to spawn. If you charge 15 bucks per coaster, then in most scenarios it only takes just 5 rides for a guest to spend all of their money, and when they're broke, they go home. After I realized that that was the issue, I did another attempt where I charged less and did manage to get to the goal in less than a year, with one of the ugliest parks ever built in a Crazy Castle scenario. It's also quite funny that I thought I was amazing at the game at the time, which was 2016 or 2017. I certainly wasn't bad, but I know so much more now than I did then. Anyway, keep this in mind if you don't have the cash machine in a pay-per-ride scenario. If the guest goal is quite high, then charging no more than 5 bucks a ride is probably a good idea. However, If you do have the cash machine, then ooh, you're gonna be rich. When a guest runs out of money, they will attempt to find a cash machine, and if they find it, they will get another $50 from it. They will keep doing this over and over forever, with no limits. Seriously, I found a guest who spent over 3,300 euros on rides and stalls over the course of 33 in-game years. You can easily make over 30,000 a month if you charge the maximum for your coasters and have enough ATMs. The search area of the guests is fairly small, so make sure to place plenty of them. For example, in this park I have 7 toilets and 21 cash machines, because it's fine if a guest pees themselves, but I can't have them leaving the park because they ran out of the good stuff and can't get more. By the way, everything I say in this video assumes that you have a good park rating. The speed of guest spawning is primarily determined by your park rating, and if you don't get any guests, you're screwed in any scenario. Keep your paths clean, have a good path layout, and if there is too much overcrowding, hire some entertainers to inject extra happiness into the guests. The rating doesn't need to be quite perfect, as the guest generation is maxed out at 850, but keeping it above that is quite a good idea. There are 2 other aspects of guest generation that are really useful to know for pay-per-ride parks, but we'll get to those later, otherwise I would be explaining the same thing twice. This covers everything about making money in scenarios where you charge for the rides. They are usually considered the easy ones to make money in compared to their counterpart, pay for entry scenarios. Here guests pay once to enter the park, and after that every ride is free. This has a lot of implications on how you can make your money. If a guest comes into the park while the entrance fee is still low, they will most likely never spend everything they spawned with. For example, the oldest guest in this empty airfield, guest 4, only spent $10 to enter and since then spent about $7 per year on stalls. That isn't very much, so the first thing that you want to do is charge as much as possible for the park entrance. How much you can charge is really quite simple, it's just all the maximum ticket prices of your rides combined. Have 2 coasters you will be able to charge $15 for if you charge for the rides, and 2 flat rides with a €4 limit. Your maximum entry fee is 15 plus 15 plus 4 plus 4 equals €38. As I mentioned earlier, in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 you can sometimes charge for both the park entry and the rides. If you charge something for a ride, then you need to subtract whatever you charge from the maximum entry fee. Again, for more details check my video about this very topic, that's linked in the description. The reason I'm not expanding on this more is that this all only really matters briefly at the start of a scenario, as you rather quickly hit another limit. The money that the guests spawn with. Look, it's great that in theory for a massive park you would be able to charge €200 or something, but if a guest only has 40, then they can never afford that. So yes, at the start you need to pay some attention to your rides. My rule of thumb is $10 per coaster and then another 10 for every 3 flat rides, but pretty quickly that doesn't matter anymore, and all you need to know is the minimum amount that guests can spawn with. There are always 4 cash amounts that guests can have when they spawn, separated by intervals of €10. For example, in Factory Capers it's 48, 58, 68 or €78, and in Evergreen Gardens it's 70, 80, 90 or 100. Usually the minimum falls between 30 and €70, and the way to check what it is to just click on a bunch of guests until you have found 2 values that are €30 apart, which are your minimum and maximum. So far you might not really realize why this is more difficult. If anything, it may sound easier as you're getting all the money up front instead of over time. Well, let's do a little experiment, shall we? This is a park in Electric Field that I built a while ago, and we'll be using it for a whole lot of experiments today. Usually you charge for the rides in Electric Fields, and I was making over 30,000 a month from them on average, which is a lot. For these tests I have reconfigured it so that you charge for the entry instead of the rides, and of course all the rides are free, and I've also removed all the guests so that we start with an empty park. The minimum that they spawn with is €40, so that's what we will charge for the entry. Let's run the park and see what happens to our income. It starts off pretty decent, with about €10,000 a month of income from the park entry, but near the end of year 1 it goes down drastically to less than €3,000 a month. Why did we suddenly stop getting new guests? It's because of a little thing called the soft guest cap. Every opened ride and stall attracts a number of guests to the park. Most stalls attract 15, a flat ride usually between 30 and 55, and most roller coasters between 75 and 120. Add all of these numbers together and you have your soft guest cap. Assuming that no rides are broken down, this park has a soft guest cap of 1445. If the number of guests is below that number, they spawn at the normal rate, but if it is above that, they spawn 4 times slower, which completely destroys your income. And this is the main issue that a lot of people run into. They build a park and do a good job getting guests, but at some point the number of guests has exceeded their soft guest cap and their income mostly dries up. The way to solve this problem is to build more rides, but that's kind of difficult if you have no money, which can make this a really difficult cycle to escape. Before we get to the fun experiments, we should discuss the 2 best, albeit a bit cheesy, solutions to this problem. The first is to build a lot of tiny rides. A wooden roller coaster will always attract 105 guests to the park, no matter its size or stats. So instead of building one woody for 15,000 euros that will increase the cap by just 105, why not build 3 smaller ones for the same price that increase it by 3 times as much? Or if you're a really big fan of cheese, why not use this tiny corkscrew coaster that costs less than the merry-go-round? It's more than 20 times cheaper than design like triple corkscrew, so for the same price you can attract 20 times more guests. This is a really effective way to get the soft guest cap as high as possible and to make sure that your park entry income doesn't dry up, but it's also not very satisfying. Sure, building 100 tiny corkscrew coasters is fun a few times to see how extreme things can get, but it gets boring pretty quickly if you use it for normal scenario play. You can still use this knowledge to build slightly smaller coasters and build a lot of flat rides, as flat rides are very cheap for the amount of guests they attract, but if you want to keep your park looking nice, there is still a limit on what you can do with this strategy. This leads us to the next slightly less cheesy but still somewhat cheesy method: advertising. You can use advertisement campaigns to get more guests. There are different campaigns that each have a different effectiveness, but they all give you a positive return on investment, with of course an exception for the one that gives coupons for free park entry. Why am I so sure that they are all always profitable? Well, it's because ads always spawn a set number of guests per time unit and ignore everything that influences the natural guest generation. The park rating, the entry fee and the soft guest cap all don't matter to ads. For example, the general ad campaign for the park costs 4,200 euros for 12 weeks, or 3 months. On average, this campaign spawns 62.5 guests per month, which is 188 in total for the 3 months. This means that you already break even when you charge just 23 bucks for your entrance, and anything above that is pure profit. In electric fields we can charge 40 bucks, which means that the average profit per month from this ad is 1,100 euros. That's not that much compared to the 10,000 we were making from natural gas generation, but this is also not the most profitable ad out of the bunch. At the very bottom comes of course the campaign for free park entry. This one does spawn the most guests with 100 per month, but they all have a coupon for free park entry, so you should only use this one if you need more guests and not if you need money. After that comes the one for half park entry with 800 euros of profit a month, followed by the aforementioned general park ad with 1100. Then comes the ad campaign for a specific ride with 1200 euros a month, and lastly there is the free food and drink one with over 1700 euros of profit a month. This one is so good because it's cheap and all the guests get is one free food item, which is usually less than 2 bucks, while still paying the full park entry price. All these ads combined is 4800 euros of profit a month, which is honestly a bit less than I expected. It is only about 50% of what I got from the natural gas generation before I hit the soft guest cap. It's of course better than nothing, but even full advertising only affords you a decently sized coaster once every 2 or 3 months. Part of the reason for the relatively low profit is that guests are fairly poor in electric fields. Not the problem usually, as you charge for the rides and have the cash machine available, but if you charge for the entrance, that will limit your profit potential. If they were 10 euros richer and spawned with at least 50 bucks, then our profit from ads would already be increased to 6,675 a month. And in Evergreen Gardens, where guests spawn with at least 70 bucks, it's over 10,000. Since Evergreen Gardens is an RCT1 scenario, you can make even more money by charging a little bit for one of your rides and also running the campaign for free ride tickets for that ride. For all the details about how ads and guest spawning work, you can watch my video about it, link in the description. The greatest thing about advertising is that it's literally just free money, and if you combine it with spamming small rides to get that soft guest cap up and also keep the natural guest generation going, you can make a whole lot of money. Building lots of smaller rides and advertising a lot also works in pay-per-ride scenarios, by the way. It doesn't really matter whether they pay for the entrance or pay for the rides, more guests will always make you more money. And if you have cash machines available, then the potential profit in pay-per-ride scenarios is insane, as any guests that you have will just keep on spending forever. Do you remember this park from an earlier shot in this video? 40 small gigacoasters that attract a total of 4,800 guests, plenty of stalls and tons of advertising can have you making over 100,000 euros a month from rides within just a single year. One thing to keep in mind is that if you start advertising immediately, you might hit your soft guest cap sooner and thus kill your natural guest generation a lot quicker. First, waiting until you've hit your soft guest cap with natural generation and then switching to advertising might save you some money in certain situations, as now you haven't generated any guests with ads that also could have been generated naturally. This is of course not a concern if you build enough rides so that you never hit your soft guest cap. If you do decide to advertise from the very start, you can choose to immediately jack up your park entry fee to the minimum that guests spawn with. This will ruin your natural guest generation until you have built enough rides, but advertising doesn't care, so that can offset that loss. Alright, we've now learned a lot and these strategies work fantastically well, but what if you don't have ads available and don't like spamming tiny rides? This is where the real fun part of the video starts, and also what originally inspired me to make it. In this setup we have a park with some kind of fairly low soft guest cap, and we want to make the most money without using ads. We do this by making guests leave as quickly as possible so that they can be replaced by a new one that pays for the entry again. The first thing that you want to do is remove all cash machines. Unless you absolutely need to keep every guest around, building cash machines in a pay-for-entry park is always a bad idea. All it does is allow guests to stay in the park while spending a minimum amount of money on things like food and drinks. In order to see the difference this makes, we need to benchmark for how much money we make without removing the cash machines. As before, we shall use this electric fields for all our experiments. 3 years is a very common scenario duration, so I'll run it for 3 years for every test. Due to awards, weather and general randomness, there can be some variability in the results, so I'll do each test 5 times and take the average of those 5 final values. I start with €0 and then just let it run for 3 years and note down how much I have in the bank at the end. With all stalls intact, I had on average €53,010 in the bank after the 3 years were finished. Our first test is with just the cash machines removed. Again, I ran it 5 times and the difference is quite large. This time on average I had nearly €79,000 at the end of the 3 years, 26,000 more than in the control test that does have cash machines. This difference is so massive because without cash machines, guests leave much sooner. There are 3 conditions that can make a guest leave once they've ridden at least one ride: being unhappy, being tired and being broke. Being broke is quantified as having less than €5 on them, which a quarter of the guests will immediately have as they spent everything they spawn with on the entrance. It doesn't make them leave immediately, as they only have a 5% chance of leaving every time this check happens, but it's checked every few seconds, so they still leave pretty quickly. If you have cash machines, there is a good chance that they will get to one and stock up before they have a chance to want to go home, and now they're staying in your park. A good way to visualize the difference is to look at when we reach the soft guest cap. With cash machines, we reach that limit of 1,445 guests around the end of year 1 and then never go under it again. This means that for 2 of the 3 years of the test, guests are spawning 4 times slower. Without cash machines, the cap is slightly lower at 1,425, but it does take us longer to get to it. It depends a bit, but usually the point we reach it is a bit before the halfway point of year 2, and from that point on then we are mostly over that cap. Sometimes enough guests leave to get us under the soft guest cap again, but then guests start spawning quicker, so it doesn't take long to reach it once more. Because cash machines are such a bad idea, they will be excluded from all future tests, as you would never build them. Let's start with now removing all the drink stalls and seeing what kind of effect that has. The idea is that when guests cannot get something to drink, they eventually get annoyed by being thirsty and go home. This does not work. Guests do not care about being thirsty, so all you do here is lose out on the money you would otherwise make from selling drinks. We went from having an average of 79,000 after 3 years to just 54,000, which means it pretty much cancels out the effect of removing cash machines. By the way, in these tests I did increase the stall prices a bit from the default, as that's a good way to make some extra money, just like in pay-per-ride scenarios. Okay, so removing drink stalls didn't help, but what about removing toilets? It's a very common myth that this makes the guests leave, but just like with being thirsty, this isn't the case. However, somehow we do earn slightly more money and have an average of just over 82,000 in the bank, 3,000 more than with the toilets. This is because I lied a little bit, and there is one place where the need to pee and the need to drink do matter, and that is when guests decide whether to immediately go on a ride again after they have ridden it. Not being able to do this probably has a very slight negative effect on their happiness, making the chance for them to leave slightly bigger. The difference is rather small though, and it would have been even smaller if I charged for the toilets in the original test. I did a quick little test with a price of 40 cents per visit, and I made about 1400 euros from toilets in 3 years. This reduces the difference between having and not having toilets to under 2,000 euros. This is close enough that I can't definitively say that it has an effect, as the variability in a single run is much larger than 2,000 euros. So removing your toilets may help, but the difference will be very small. Food though is a whole different beast, and removing food stalls does make guests go home quicker. So far, being broke was our main way to make the guests leave, but if they're too tired, they will also leave. If guests are very hungry, they start losing energy, so if they can't get food, then after a year or so the first guests are tired enough to want to go home and leave the park. This allows new guests to replace them, leading to an increase in profit. Or does it? I was very surprised when I saw the results of this test, as we actually made significantly less money. Just removing the cash machines was 79,000 after 3 years, while also removing food stalls gets it down to just 67,500. Why? Well, we do get more guests and do make more from the park entrance, but we lose out on much more from food and drink sales. Yes, also drink sales, as eating food is the main cause of guests getting thirsty. There are 2 more factors that come into play here. When guests pay for food and drinks, they slowly become broke, which also causes them to leave. Especially the ones that spawn with 50 bucks are really close and only need to buy a few things before they are under that limit of 5 euros. The second factor is that food stalls also attract guests. This park has 7 food stalls, which combined attract 105 guests, which is not entirely insignificant compared to our total of 1425. If the guests were richer, then this would be more effective, as the loss of food income would stay the same while the gain in park entry fee income would increase. To test this, I changed it so that the guests now spawn with 70 to 100 euros instead of 40 to 70, and ran 2 more batteries of 5 runs. One with just no cash machines as the control test, and the other with also no food stalls. It turns out that with this entry price it roughly breaks even, and the difference was quite small, but removing food stalls still led to a slight decrease. There aren't many scenarios where guests are even richer than this, so this isn't a good strategy. Alright, we have now done all the stalls, and it turns out that outside of the obvious cash machine, the only other stall that might be worth removing is the bathroom, but food and drink stalls are definitely not worth it. Keep them around. The exact numbers and ratios will be different in different parks, but outside of some very extreme situations, such as making all your food and drinks free, the conclusion will not change. What about other strategies though? What if we increase the entry price from 40 to 50 euros? This means that a quarter of the guests, the ones that spawn with 40, won't be able to enter, leaving more space for richer guests. To be entirely honest, I didn't have high hopes for this, but boy was I wrong. On the first run, I immediately smashed any previous record and had over 114,000 euros in the bank at the end. And this was by far the worst run of the 5, as at the end the average was 136,000 euros, 47,000 more than charging 40 bucks. This is so much more profitable than it should be if you just look at the 10 euro increase from the park entry fee, but I can explain it. If you charge 40 euros, then after entering, a quarter of the guests will have nothing left, a quarter has 10 left, a quarter has 20, and the final quarter has 30 euros left. The ones with nothing left immediately have a chance to want to go home, and the ones with 10 get there reasonably quickly after buying a few things. The other half, the ones with 20 and 30 left, take a lot longer and stay around for a while. If you charge 50 instead of 40, then it's a third who have nothing after entering and another third that become broke very quickly. In fact, because we reject a quarter of the guests and the others are leaving quicker, we don't even hit the soft guest cap at all. If you remember the test without just cash machines, it took until the first half of year 2 to reach the cap, and after that we spent most of the time with 4 times slower guest generation. Well, when charging 50 bucks, so many guests leave so quickly that we get stuck in the 1200 and 1300s and thus enjoy a full 3 years of maximum guest spawning rates. This is of course not very useful in a scenario like Amity Airfield where the goal is 3000 guests, but you could employ this strategy for the first 2 years and then add cash machines or lower the entry price to get to that goal. You can also apply this to pay-per-ride scenarios where you don't have cash machines. Earlier I said that charging the absolute most for your rides if you don't have cash machines is usually a bad idea because guests will leave too quickly and you won't reach the goal. But if the guest count isn't of any concern while the soft guest cap is, then making them go broke quicker by charging a ton for the rides can make you more money as they can be replaced by new guests sooner. Even if you completely ignore all of this and we wouldn't actually get more guests, then charging 50 bucks is still only slightly worse than charging 40. When you charge 40, every guest enters the park, so you make on average 40 bucks per guest on the entrance. If you charge 50, then 3/4 of the guests enter, which is still an average of 37.5 euros, barely less than 40. In fact, if the minimum that guests can spawn with is less than 30 euros, this is just a straight upgrade, no matter what. Well, actually the breaking even amount is slightly lower than that, as with fewer guests in the park you do miss out on some revenue from shops and stalls. Where the exact limit is where charging the amount of the second poorest guest becomes more profitable differs per park, but it will be somewhere between a 25 and 30 euro minimum spawning amount. And of course, as we have just seen, it will always be profitable if your soft guest cap is a concern. With richer guests, like in Evergreen Gardens where they spawn with a minimum of 70, you do make a bit less money initially when doing this, but once you would otherwise have hit the soft guest cap, you still benefit massively from quicker leaving guests and thus getting new guests that pay for the entry again. Since we already don't reach the soft guest cap when we charge 50 in electric fields, it's not gonna be useful to charge even more. Although, interestingly, charging 60 bucks and rejecting half of all the guests is still slightly more profitable than charging 40 and accepting everyone. You do get stuck at about 500 guests, so in every single one of the 5 runs I failed the goal. The takeaway here is that charging the amount that the second poorest guest spawns with is very profitable and will make you a ton of money. Just be careful with guest goals as you won't get a lot of guests in your park at the same time this way. What we haven't tried is to make guests leave by making them unhappy, and there's a good reason for that. The guest spawning rate depends on your park rating, and the park rating in return is very significantly influenced by the happiness of your guests. So if you have a super severe overcrowding issue, then everyone gets unhappy, which kills your park rating and thus your guest spawning rate. Having a few unhappy guests has no impact, so a little bit of overcrowding or other ways to make them sad could work, but it's usually best to stick to the other methods. Speaking of other methods, there are a few more unorthodox and more cheesy ones that we need to look at. The first is closing the park for a while halfway through to force the guests out and allow new guests to replace them. Just closing the park doesn't do very much. It will make any guest that bumps into the exit leave, but it won't make guests want to leave. To help that along, I also closed all the rides. I did this once halfway through the run at the start of July year 2 and kept everything closed for 2 months. This causes nearly 1,000 guests to leave, and by the time I reopened everything, I usually had the guest count in the 500s. Now there is tons of space again for new guests, and at the end I had an average of 92,500 in the bank, which is 13,500 more than when I didn't do this closing thing. That's not that much actually, but it also does not tell the whole story. The first half of these two runs are identical, and on average I made a little under 57,000 euros in that first half. That leaves 22 and 36,000 respectively for the second half of these tests, a 61% increase. So if you're doing this in a longer scenario and you do it multiple times, the increase will be quite significant. There is a more effective way to do this, and that is to use no entry signs to direct your guests to the park exit. In this test I built a whole load of them, and when I closed all the rides in the park I also set all the signs to no entry. Because I knew it would be more effective, I did this twice per run instead of just once. Once at the start of year 2 and once at the start of year 3. Whereas in the previous test it took 2 months to get down to about 500 guests, here it only takes 20 days to get down to about 200. After these 20 days I reopened everything and the money could start flowing in again, much quicker than before. Because this does take quite a while to do and is prone to mistakes, so I have to redo it a lot, I only did 2 tests instead of 5. The average of this is 125,000 euros, which is a lot and doesn't even fall that far behind the current best strategy of charging 50 euros instead of 40. It is a lot of work to place all the no entry signs, lock them and then unlock them again, but it will absolutely save your ass if you need to make more money now. If you are a fan of cheese, then this next method might be up your alley. There is a bug in the game that makes it so that guests have a good chance of falling through the path right after entering the park if that path is sloped upwards. Usually this doesn't do very much and they just get on the path again, but if that path piece is underground they fall into the void and disappear, making space for a new guest. And of course, most importantly, this doesn't kill your park rating and it's treated as if they simply just left the park. So how much money do we make in 3 years if we have no cash machines and this setup? It is very effective and the results are pretty much identical to charging 50 euros for the entry. It was 136,000 for that one and it's 135,000 for the entrance void method. The chance that they fall through seems to be about 37%, which means that 37% of the guests that enter immediately leave the park, ready to be replaced by another. We do eventually still hit the soft guest cap, so it's not an absolutely perfect strategy for making money, but it is very strong. Unfortunately for this method, this bug has been fixed recently in OpenRCT 2. I think it's a very good thing that it's been fixed, but it does mean that if you're playing on version 0.4.20 or newer, you cannot use this. It also doesn't work on RCT Classic for mobile and Switch, but it does work in RCT 1 and RCT 2 and on any OpenRCT 2 version before 0.4.20. You can do the same thing in a different way by putting a right exit underground and have it have no exit path. The guests will simply fall into the void and disappear, aka leave the park. If I do this for the most popular ride in the park, the periwinkle colored looping coaster called Frederick, it is already enough to make us never reach 1,000 guests. We now have a perfect setup for making money as we let everyone in and never reach the soft guest cap. Except for when it breaks down, as then it cannot be fixed as no mechanic can reach it. The solution here is using a maze or another ride that cannot break down. By placing just one maze in a strategic position, we're already nearly on the level of the entry void and charging 50 bucks with 130,000 on average. You can never make it perfect with just mazes, as there are a lot of guests that will never go on one of them as they're not intense enough. A lift would be better, and that's exactly what we have in Amity Airfield. If you build one lift with an underground exit to help the guests escape the park and also build a few freefalls with a mechanic to increase the maximum entry fee, it will make over 50,000 euros a year purely by itself. If you also advertise and maybe build a second lift to help exterminate all the guests, you will make even more money. Okay, that's all very fun and interesting, but what's the point of this? First of all, it's just fun to optimize as much as possible and see that number go up. But setups like these have helped me complete extreme challenges. One that comes to mind is seeing if I could completely excavate Crazy Castle before the deadline. With challenges like that, you grab every opportunity to make as much money as you can, and then it's quite useful to know all of these tricks. A while back, when I talked about what can make a guest want to leave the park, I said after they have ridden at least one ride. This is because if a guest hasn't ridden a ride yet a few minutes after they have entered the park, they will also want to go home. So you can very easily make a lot of money by putting down a no entry sign to prevent guests from going past the first pass tile and plopping down a few entertainers to keep them happy until they leave. This fulfills a similar role to the lift or other void ride and can be useful for some weird challenges. The only way you can improve these methods is to focus on getting as many awards as possible. Each positive award that you have active multiplies your guest generation speed by 1.25, so they're quite effective, especially if you have multiple and they stack. You can't guarantee an award, but you can maximize your chances by making sure you qualify for as many as possible. A lot of them are quite easy to qualify for, and all you have to do is, for example, build a few gentle rides or paint all your rides a specific color. I have linked a guide on how to get every single one of them and how to avoid the bad ones in the description. To summarize this video, in paper ride parks you should charge a ton for your rides, place cash machines if you can, and get as many guests if you can by advertising and building lots of cheap rides. In pay for entry parks there are two strategies. You can either build lots of cheap rides to get the soft guest cap as high as possible and supplement that with advertising to make even more money, or you can force guests out quicker by removing all cash machines, charging the cash amount of the second poorest guest instead of the poorest, and using a void ride. I hope you learned something from this video and that in the future you will go bankrupt a little less frequently. To see me try to beat all scenarios with a starting budget of exactly nothing, click right here. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.